Welcome everyone, I'm your host Jay Cack, and today for our 5th episode of the Farms of BC podcast, we'll be sitting down with Nav to discuss the most important considerations when it comes to farmland due diligence. If you're looking to make a purchase in the near future, you do not want to miss this one. All right, man. Farmland due diligence.
Yeah.
We got soil, and I wanted to discuss the 3 main types of soil. We have clay, we got peat,
Yep.
and we got sandy soil.
That's right.
Most familiar with sandy soil myself, but maybe you know the different crops that are doing well on the other types as well.
Yeah. Fraser Valley, Greater Vancouver, the 3 dominant types of soils you're going to see in farmland are sandy soil, peat soil, and then you'll kind of have a clay soil. On the sandy soil is probably one of the best. Very limited amount of spots within the Fraser Valley have sandy soil, like really good sandy soil, which is high and dry, it naturally drains well. Those are really good for any type of berry, blueberries, raspberries, ideally great for grapes. And then you could do vegetables on there as well, but we've seen that vegetables thrive really well in peaty and clay soil. On peat soil, you can still do blueberries. It's perfectly fine. What we have seen is yields in sandy soils. Berry tends to yield almost double versus peaty soil. On clay soil, berries are not the greatest on clay soil, and that's mostly good to get the highest production. It's good for vegetables.
And I mean, the real thing about soil is how it drains, right? So at the end of the day, it's the sandy soil is the one that's draining really well. So it's good for those crops that require a little bit of dryness, right? At the end of the day,
it's a natural draining fields where in peaty soils you can still make a good drained field as long as you have a good drainage plan, and you will have to install some sort of drainage system underground. Where I've seen is people will typically spread their drainage pipes anywhere from 20 to 30 feet, just so the field dries faster, which is still fine. But ideally, sandy soil is what most farmers are looking for. And it does bring a better value when people do tend to sell those types of properties. Yeah.
And I know there's one other type. I mean, in Huntington, we see a lot of gravel in the soil as well, which is good. A lot of raspberry thrives there.
Yeah. That's what falls in that sandy soil. Yeah. Nicely drained, rocky, but still has a good top layer of topsoil, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And in some conditions, people do try to avoid the clay, but at the end of the day, if you use it right, you can still make the best of it, right? Yeah. So it's still.
And it's like every time you're going to go buy a farm, it is good to get these soil conditions tested. Yeah. Really know what you're getting yourself into. You can get the pH tested to see where the pH levels are. You can test what type of soils underneath, and then depending on your crop, your consultant, which we have good contacts with, could tell you, hey, this is a good property for that specific crop or not.
Yeah, and I mean, when we're actually doing our offers, typically we'll have that soil testing subject in there, even though exactly. Even though we don't have, if you're trying to improve the strength of your offer, sometimes we don't have that financing one in there because the owner or the buyer feels content with not having that in there. But we usually typically have this in there just so they have that security, knowing that what they're trying to do on this farm is actually going to be done.
Achievable,
right? So definitely, I think soil subject to that is very important. Oil tanks, maybe you can speak to those.
Yeah, oil tanks, the homes that were built in the 50s, 60s, 70s, maybe even early 80s, most areas never had access to natural gas, so most rural areas. So people had put oil tanks for some sort of heating system. Now they either did overhead, which was above ground, either they put it in their crawl space in their home, or they had put them underground outside next to their home. Oil tanks are one of those things that if it wasn't drained and removed properly, and it's still on the property and it has oil in it, it could be a big problem. So one thing we always highly recommend is buyers to do, it's called an oil scan. So what they do is they'll come out and with like almost like a metal detector, they'll scan the perimeter of the home and all barns and buildings just to make sure that there's no tank underneath, right? And if there is, we typically ask the seller to get that removed at their cost.
Yeah, it's the remediation cost that really hits.
Well, it's the risk of the remediation cost, because once they start digging around it and then they see any oil that's been leaking out, then you've got to dig all of that dirt. You gotta dump it at a contaminated site. So you just got to handle it differently, which it could be quite costly. One of my sellers did have that. She didn't even know. We didn't even know. So when they did the oil scan, she was surprised that it was there. And she had to remove it. It was almost close to $25,000.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. So it's a significant cost. It is important to have that subject in there for due diligence.
Definitely.
I mean, we had that one example where we were doing one property together, and basically we had a false positive where we didn't know if it was an oil tank, but we didn't want to run the risk. So it almost broke the deal. And, we were kind of like, okay, we got to get this figured out. So we did the excavation. We paid for the excavation, well, not us, but the client. But at the end of the day, it was worth it because we found out that there was no oil tank, and it was just a small cost to do the excavation, whereas it would have been a major cost if they, actually had an oil tank in there.
Yeah, buyers won't take that risk and remove subjects if there's something that alerts them that there is an oil tank. You're right. It's better to spend $1,500 to $2,000, do the dig, and kind of scan it and see if there really is one.
And there's a lot of things that could be under there. Turns out in that example, it was a swimming pool,
which
is a buried swimming pool, right? Because the property was rented out, and they didn't want the liability of a pool on the property. So it was funny, but it was funny afterwards. It wasn't funny during the actual deal. It was a little stressful.
That was a fun one.
Yeah. Alrighty. I guess next up is crops and tissue samples and what.
Yeah. So like when you're buying land and it has like a permanent type crop. Raspberries, blueberries, blackberries, anything that's like permanent that it's going to be there year after year. It's good to check the soil conditions, like I mentioned before, just to make sure that they're good. The biggest thing that I would say a lot of residential realtors miss when they are buying a blueberry farm is they never do a tissue sample. It costs $400 or $500 to do a tissue sample test. And what they do is they'll take leaves from random areas throughout the farm, and they'll test for diseases. So they'll know what type of diseases that these plants hold, if any. And when you look at a berry bush, it always looks like it's perfectly fine. You'll never know the diseases until you get them tested, right? I know some people that bought farms back in the day where they never got it tested, and then there was these certain viruses that would just not go away, right? So that's very important to do tissue sampling on the existing crops, because that's your income that you're going to be relying on. Definitely put that tissue sample clause in there for anything that's a blueberry farm, raspberry farm, or a blackberry farm.
Yeah, subject to tissue sample, right? I feel like that's a huge important thing.
And we've been doing that for a very long time.
Yeah, it's essentially the same as getting your blood tested, for example, as you should be doing regularly, right? And at the end of the day, that's the only way you're going to find out what's happening underneath and what's happening inside, right? Yeah. So you want to know what you're purchasing, so make sure you put that in there.
Yeah, and like even when you're buying bare land, if you love a really nice location, and so when you do the soil testing and the pHs are not good, you can always add lime or sulfur, depending on the soil and where the pH is, to correct the pH. So before you plant any certain type of crop, what they do is the consultant will tell you to spread out lime, till it, mix it in, let it settle for a couple months, and then retest it. And then the pH will change very aggressively to where you want it. Then you do your planting. Then you'll be able to get a nice, good growing plant.
And even in soil, when you're going back to the soil side of things, when you're trying to change the pH of the soil, you can actually have clay soil kind of break down a little bit easier by doing that as well.
That's right.
So a lot of these consultants can advise accordingly how to do that, right? So that's very helpful. Now, this is one of those topics that we've kind of covered in the building section, but preloading and filling the land. And now this is a part of due diligence that's quite important, because if your plans are to build, or if your plans are to do something, in terms of a structure, you want to have the lay of the land be according to what you want, right? So.
So when you're buying a property in the floodplain, you do have to preload. So you'll get a footprint of an area where you're allowed to preload to build your house. They'll allow you additional preload for your barn or building. Typically, what you want to do is you apply for a fill permit, and you're supposed to bring in external fill, which is most likely structural fill, where it's hard and compact, and then they compact it until it's at a certain elevation. Most municipalities like it at 2.4 meters above the flood grade, which is 0. So once it settles there, then you can go ahead and build. That's for houses and buildings. What about acreage that we've seen that is just low and a lot of water sits there? A lot of farm owners sometimes don't know that they can fill their entire property. Now, in order to do that, there is a process. It's not easy, but the way you go about that is as long as you're going to be farming and you can prove that you're going to enhance it for that fill or that farm for agriculture, you will have to apply to the land commission. You will have to apply to the city, and you'd have to convert that into a farm and a full operating farm. So the way that works is you're supposed to scrape all the existing peat that's on the property. Then you bring in structural fill to raise the land to the elevation that the ALC and the city approve you for. And then you put back that peat's topsoil, and then you plant your harvest. Yeah, and when you do that filling, you're supposed to let the land literally settle for about a year before you do any harvest. So all the organic matter really mixes. And you also have to take into consideration, once you're raising your land, you now potentially are running that water off to your neighboring property. So you need to have a good drainage plan to show that water won't affect your neighbors as well, right? So a lot of people didn't know that, but that can be done. Yeah.
I imagine the best situation where you're going to be doing that is probably maybe a cranberry farm if you're trying to elevate that. I assume that's something.
Cranberry farm, there's some farms just in floodplain areas where, in general, that just, it's always wet. It's just always water sitting there. It doesn't have good drainage. So the only other option is to raise the land. I have seen a few, actually quite a few farms that have that approval. But it's on a case to case. It's not that just because there's water sitting there that you're automatically going to get that permit. But that is something, if you're looking at a property that does have that and you see that, but you love the location and you really want this property, put in a subject to see if you can get a preliminary approval if that can happen, if that's important to you.
Yeah, I imagine that would take a while though, just to get.
It would take a while. It's about a 90-day turnaround.
Well, it's good to know that it is even possible, right?
Possible,
so that's huge, and it kind of naturally leads into the next one, which is creeks. I mean, if that kind of disturbs the other runoff creeks or something like that, I imagine they probably wouldn't approve it. The
creeks are very sensitive, and especially with the city and the provincial government, they don't really want you to do anything around these creeks. They've kept these big buffers. Like for development property, the buffer is 30 meters. Now, for farmland, they say it's 30 meters. Sometimes, depending on who you talk to the city, they'll say it's 15 meters. But when the setback from any creek or water course, depending on what color it is, it's anywhere from 5 meters up to about 30 meters. Red being the most aggressive, the biggest setback, and green being the lowest setback. And that just shows the use of that creek. If it's green, that's usually very minimal water flow. They may even allow you to fill it or redirect it. Solid red is pretty much flowing water, even salmon or even fish in there that will always be flowing through there, right? Yeah. So depending on that, that's what the city will set your setback. Now with creeks, I know you always get this, people will always say, is there any creeks on your farm? Creeks are on development property, I understand, because of the big wastage of land. When it comes to farming, creeks and ditches are good, depending on where it's located and if you can access the other side. So if there's a creek going in the middle of the property and there's a culvert to access the back, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Right. Those creeks are good for drainage, right? And these ditches are good for drainage. But if you can't access the back or it's costly to build a bridge, that's when you need to analyze, okay, out of this 10 or 20 acres, what's really usable, right? And sometimes we see creeks at the edge of the property. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that.
It's actually ideal because that's where you want it to be.
Yeah, you can drain into that, or just slope the land naturally that it drains to that.
Exactly. And then what if you mentioned it's possible that it can be removed? How does that process work?
Well, it's on a case-to-case basis. The way they do it is you'd have to hire an environmentalist who would go and write a report to specify if there is any use for those creeks. These creeks were all registered and labeled by satellite mapping many years ago. So now if you get designated as a certain class or it gets designated on your property, and you want it removed, you have to get some professional consultant to come in, write up a report, file it to the city, file it to DFO, Department of Fisheries, and they will assess, okay, yes, you can remove it, or yes, you can fill it, or yes, you can divert it.
We've had quite a bit of success with environmental surveys, like putting that subject in there, subject to environmental survey, and then finding out that from 30 meters, it's been reduced to only 15 meters, allowing you to use so much more of the land, or for example, remove it entirely.
You know, when you go to the city is going to give you a textbook answer. They literally have a bylaw book. They'll say A1 or agricultural land, creek, red, setback 30 meters. They're not going to tell you how to get around that. So we have methods or contacts to get that from 30 to 15 to 10 to 5, depending on the situation. Now, you know, they want the setback to be wider if there's a house that's going to be going close to there. They might push for that 15 to 30. But say if it's a barn or building, you might get away with like 10 to 15 or even 5. Right? Meter distance of a setback. And the way the fisheries are, they naturally don't want you to touch that buffer. They want you to keep it natural vegetation. They don't even want you to cut the grass within that buffer. They want you to leave it natural. Now, does that happen? Sometimes.
And the biggest thing is trees. If there's trees anywhere near that creek,
you're not allowed to. Yeah, you're not allowed.
Very strict.
Very sensitive. Yeah.
How they work. And we deal with it almost daily, where we see a large patch of trees and we're kind of curious why that's not been removed.
Yeah.
And if we don't already know, we already assume that there's a creek there. And that's the reason why they didn't remove it, right? Whereas everything else has been already removed. And finally, title searches.
Yeah, just, you know, doing your due diligence on the land physically is one thing, but, you know, pulling the title and really digging deep, what are the charges on this property? That is very crucial, very important. We always recommend to put a subject in for the buyer to review the title, pull all the charges from your lawyer and review them. Most of our buyers, we do pull all the charges for them, get them the information right away. Usual typical turnaround time is 48 hours. And so they can review it themselves. But we always tell them, you know, you're going to be buying a property from a lawyer. Lawyer has to do the closing. You might as well get them to look over it as well.
And I mean, yes, we do run it through our title search company and the lawyers there. However, it's best to review those results with your own lawyer.
That's right.
And kind of see what the implications are for yourself, right? And based on what you're trying to do. And I mean, what is a clean title?
Clean title, typically there's no covenants, easements, right-of-ways. You may have a mortgage on it or not. That's still considered clean because that gets removed.
I mean, that's typical.
Yeah, you know, but, you know, covenants are put on typically by the city for specific reasons, or it might be put on by utility companies. Those covenants typically are never removed, unless if it's timed, like that the covenant stays for a certain period of time. Easements typically never get removed. Right-of-ways typically never get removed. Those are usually that run with the title. And it's always good to know where those right-of-ways and easements are on the property and see if it affects the property or your plan, right? And then you've got your mortgage. You'll have your mortgage on there. That's quite normal. Those mortgages, it's up to the seller to have that mortgage removed and provide you the title clean. They will also, sometimes you might find a litigation on title where someone is suing them, or a divorce, or just someone is claiming something on that land. So most times it's up to the seller's responsibility to get that removed So they should, ideally, before they put something on sale, is try to resolve that before you put it for sale. And in the worst case scenario, if it doesn't get resolved and there's a buyer ready, willing, and able to purchase, the amount of that claim, so say if it was a $5,000 claim or a $10,000 claim, the lawyers will put that in trust and they'll fight for it after, but they'll let the sale transact and go through. So it's not that there's nothing wrong with litigation or anybody putting a charge or a lien on the property. They'll just put that money in trust and fight with the other individual after, but they'll let the transact happen.
And I mean, that's the reason why you want to run it by your lawyer, because there may be so many different versions of this, you know, and it may impact you pretty significantly if you're not really going into it prepared, right? On the topic of covenants, I do have some personal experience with this, and I mean, there is always, you know, certain things that they'll restrict, but there's always a way out. They'll give you the options in terms of, you know, you have to do X, Y, Z to get this covenant removed. If it's placed by the city, that is, right? If it's just been there for many, many years, usually they'll always have a reason.
Well, most covenants are by the city.
And they'll always have a reason and a way out if it's reasonable, right? So at the end of the day, we did get it removed, but took a lot of consulting with the city and everything else to kind of get that done. It's a tough process. It took about 6 years for me.
You're talking about the covenant where you were not allowed to build a house on your property because of a situation that happened in the past. That situation is really one-off. And you know, I think and I think your situation there, I don't think they had anything to stand on. It didn't benefit agriculture in any which way. It was more of an ego thing that the city had put on.
It is what it is, but at the end of the day, it got resolved. So I mean, at the end of the day, if you're not reviewing these things with your lawyer and you don't know how to approach them, nothing's going to happen, right? So it's the first step is just knowledge and getting your due diligence out of the way. That pretty much concludes farmland due diligence.
And then just, you know, just last final tips is there's a lot of things on farmland that, you know, when you buy a farm, everyone sometimes just think they're just buying dirt, buying land. There's so much that goes into it, and these studies are not expensive and they don't take much time to do. So we always highly recommend put these subjects in. Make sure your realtors are consulting with certain companies to make sure that the field that they're looking at does fit your goals. And that's very important. There's times where we've told buyers to walk away from certain properties just because we just knew that long term it wouldn't have fit their crop goals, right?
Yeah. Awesome, man. That concludes episode 5. On to the next one.